We're going to continue where we left off last week. What we're doing this quarter is comparing the story of Christianity to reality, and seeing if the Christian worldview is the best explanation for the world that we live in. And so far, it's been holding up pretty well, as I'm sure you expected. A few weeks ago, Tim introduced to us the part of the story that involves Jesus. And he talked to us about who Jesus was and why he came. And so we paused again for the comparison. When we compared the Bible story of Jesus to the world, what do we find? And there are four possibilities. And those are, because of the claims that he made, he could have been a legend, a liar, a lunatic, or he could have been who he claimed to be, the Lord. It doesn't work to say, as many people say these days, well, I have a lot of respect for Jesus and I like his teachings, I just don't believe he's the Son of God. He doesn't give you that option because he's constantly claiming to be the Son of God, the only way to the Father, the great I am. And so he's either one of those four options, a legend, a liar, a lunatic, or the Lord. Here's how C.S. Lewis laid it out in his book, Mere Christianity. He says, I'm trying here to prevent anyone saying the really foolish thing that people often say about Jesus. I'm ready to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That is the one thing we must not say. A man who is merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Now, it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. Before we visited that trilemma, as it's often called, we talked about the possibility that he's a legend. That was last week. And we answered the challenges that said that the story of Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection was borrowed from pagan cultures. If you missed that, you can go back and listen to it online. But we're turning now to the last three options, those that were presented by Lewis in Mere Christianity: liar, lunatic, or Lord. And there's no question that he made bold claims. Just really quickly, let me give you a few examples. I've already mentioned a few. But when he said to the man who'd been lowered down through the roof by his friends, in Mark chapter 2, verse 5, "My son, your sins are forgiven," he was accused of blasphemy. And that accusation would have been correct if he wasn't who he claimed to be. But he was God, therefore he did have the power and authority to forgive sins. Another example, when he was arguing with the Pharisees in John 8, in verse 58, he said, "Before Abraham was, I am." There's some interesting grammar involved there, because what he's doing with that phrase, "I am," is not only saying, I lived to see the day of your father Abraham. Not only was he saying, I'm greater than Abraham, but he's identifying himself with the Creator, the self-existent one. He's saying, I am God, using the name God gave Moses at the burning bush. That's a divine claim, John 8:58. What about John 14:6? I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. That's an exclusive claim, and people today don't like those kinds of things. But here you have Jesus doing it. Now, who is he? This great moral teacher that's popular with everybody? Or somebody who excluded based on his own claims? One last example. When he was on trial before the high priest asked him point blank in Mark 14:61, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Jesus' answer, "I am. I'm the Christ, the Son of the Blessed." Can't get plainer than that. So he puts us in a position here where we have to jettison all this idea of a great moral teacher, and we have these 4 options. The last 3 we're going to look at tonight. So let's start. That was last week. Was Jesus a liar? Was he a liar? Let's look at some of the people who tried to make that point. Here is a theory made by Karl Barth. He said, in order to gain a hearing from the Jews, Jesus claimed to be the Messiah, planning to spiritualize the concept of Messiah by hoaxing his death and resurrection. To bring this about, Jesus provoked his arrest and trial by his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. His supporters, who secretly sat on the Sanhedrin, ensured his condemnation. Luke, the physician, prepared Jesus' body by means of drugs to withstand the rigors of crucifixion for an indefinite time. I'll stop right there. There are many problems here, but one is that Luke wasn't anywhere close to Jesus during his lifetime. Luke was Paul's physician, so I find that humorous that he's brought Luke in at the wrong time. But he goes on to say, by crying loudly and slumping his head, Jesus feigned his death on the cross, and a bribe to the centurion guaranteed that his legs would not be broken. Joseph of Arimathea, who was in on this too, took Jesus to a cave where he resuscitated Jesus by his ministrations. On the 3rd day, they pushed aside the stone over the mouth of the cave, and Jesus went forth, frightening away the guards and appearing to Mary and subsequently to his other disciples. Therefore, he lived in seclusion among his fellow conspirators. That is some great fiction. There's no evidence behind this at all. The only thing behind it is a willingness not to believe the gospel accounts. So that's one way that a person would explain away Jesus' claims, calling him a liar. Here's another example. This is Hugh Schoenfield in his book, The Passover Plot. And I paraphrased a lot of this. He said Jesus manipulated his life in such a way as to counterfeit the events described in the Old Testament prophecies about the Messiah. At times this required contriving those events when necessary, contending with friends and foes to ensure that the predictions would be fulfilled. Jesus plotted and schemed with the utmost skill and resourcefulness. Thomas sometimes making secret arrangements, taking advantage of every circumstance conducive to the attainment of his objectives. Jesus even planned to fake his own death on the cross. Unfortunately, however, Jesus had not counted on having a Roman soldier pierce his side with a spear. Thus, instead of recovering from his stupor, Jesus died unexpectedly. On Saturday night, his body was moved to a secret place so that his tomb would be empty on the next day, thus leaving the impression of his resurrection. Again, a fanciful tale told by a skeptic, absolutely no historical grounds, no archaeological grounds to base it on, mere fantasy. But this is the charge that Jesus was a liar. I have here a fragment of an old Gnostic gospel that was discovered rather recently called the Gospel According to Judas. There are a lot of this pseudepigrapha floating around. Those are writings attributed to authors who did not really write them. And this is an example. You can see how little of it we have. But those who have studied it say it tells the story of Judas being Jesus' only true disciple, and that he and Judas were in league with one another to stage his death, burial, and resurrection. And that's another claim that Jesus was not who he said to be, that he was a liar. A few questions takes care of this theory. First of all, even if Jesus would have been able to beguile a few followers in believing that he had fulfilled a few of the prophecies, how could he have possibly fulfilled all those messianic prophecies by contriving them? I'll come back to this point at the end of the lesson, but just a couple to think about. He was betrayed for money, right? 30 pieces of silver. This was prophesied in Zechariah chapter 11, I think. 30 pieces of silver, not 29, not 31, not pieces of gold, not pieces of bronze, pieces of silver. Hundreds of years before his birth, this was stated, and that was the exact price offered to Judas Iscariot. How did he work that out behind the scenes? Even harder to believe would be that he was able to work out the casting lots for his clothing that's mentioned in Psalm 22. I mean, did he make a deal before the Roman soldiers put him on the cross? Hey, if you guys don't mind, I'm trying to do something here. Could you cast lots for my clothing while I hang up here? That kind of prophecy can't just be contrived. There might have been some, for instance, in the Old Testament, it is said that the Messiah would speak in parables. So I understand somebody thinking, well, he could have read that and acted that out in trying to pass himself off as the Messiah. But never would he have been able to do all 300 prophecies that way. Another point to consider, how could an impostor with so much deceit and selfishness and ambition, worldly ambition, accomplish the good that Jesus accomplished in his short life on earth? When you read about his actions and his words, even the greatest actor would not have been able to pull that off. How could you imagine that such a man would be a deceiver? And then finally, you have to ask, what's in it for him? I mean, con men are after some gain, right? Some material gain. Now, I know one of the theories is he didn't know the Romans were going to stab him with the spear, and it kind of ruined his plan. But he's putting himself in mortal danger here. If he was a deceiver, what was in it for him? What could he possibly stand to gain? Blaise Pascal said, I believe the witnesses who get their throats cut. And if you think about it, you know what he means there. The ones who die for their truth are probably the ones telling the truth, or the ones who at least believe their truth. You can accuse them of a lot of things, and we'll get into the lunatic accusation next, but being a con man, trying to gain something, that's a really hard one to pass over on people. So it just doesn't make sense that he was a liar. So let's look at the next possibility. Could he have been a lunatic? Meaning, could he have been insane? Maybe there was something wrong with his mind so that he wasn't lying because he really believed he was the Son of God, but he wasn't. Well, this accusation is not made nearly as much as the deceit and the legend, but it was made back in his day. Look at a few verses. Mark chapter 3, verse 22. And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem were saying, he is possessed by Beelzebul, and by the prince of demons he casts out the demons. Of course, Jesus answered that charge very rationally. Why would the prince of demons cast out demons? A house divided against itself cannot stand. That sounds like a very rational person who has possession of his mental faculties. But saying he has a demon is kind of similar to saying he's a lunatic, right? What about John chapter 8, verse 48? The Jews answered him, are we not right in saying that you are a Samaritan and have a demon? Now, all Samaritans were not mentally ill, but you know how much they hated Samaritans. And so they were trying to find the biggest insults they could throw at him. And from their point of view, that would be to call him a Samaritan and to say he has a demon. And if you look at the accounts of those who are demon-possessed, they weren't in control of their mental faculties. They weren't even in control of their speech. The demons would speak through them. They weren't in control of their bodies. And so this was the charge made to try to discredit him. There are other examples. His family, Mary, his brothers, his sisters, when they heard it, they went out to seize him, for they were saying, he is out of his mind. Literally, the Greek is beside himself, as if his body is here and his mind is over here, out of his body. And then finally, John 10, verse 20, many of them said, he has a demon and is insane. Why listen to him? Now, it's true that Jesus was different, but that's not the same thing as saying he had lost his mind. He was different because he didn't follow the traditions of the elders. He was different because on the Sabbath he allowed his disciples to pluck grain. He was different because he allowed them to eat with unwashed hands. He was different because on the Sabbath he would heal people. He was different because he would dine with tax collectors and sinners. He was different because he didn't march to the tune of the religious establishment of his day, and that's why people hated him. He was different, but that's not the same thing as saying that he's certifiable. Now, an easy way to prove that he wasn't a lunatic is just to look at some examples of his interactions with some of the most brilliant minds of his day. They were interested in discrediting him with these theological puzzles and philosophical and legal conundrums. So let's look at a few examples, starting with Mark chapter 12, verses 13 and following. This is about paying taxes to Caesar. Mark 12:13, they sent to him some of the Pharisees and some of the Herodians to trap him in his talk. The Herodians were loyal to Rome. The Pharisees, of course, were not. So there are two sides that are interested in this and waiting to pounce on him. He can't win, they're thinking, because he's going to have to take one side or the other. And they came and said to him, "Teacher, we know that you are true and do not care about anyone's opinion, for you are not swayed by appearances, but truly teach the way of God." You think that was a sincere compliment? I don't think so. I kind of feel like those words were dripping with sarcasm. But anyway, they said that, and then they asked their question. Is it lawful to pay taxes to Caesar or not? Should we pay them or should we not? Remember, the Herodians are standing on one side, you should pay them. The Pharisees on the other side, you shouldn't pay them. Both parties are extremely powerful. But knowing their hypocrisy, he said to them, "Why put me to the test? Bring me a denarius." That's a day's wage. "And let me look at it." And they brought one. And he said to them, "Whose likeness and inscription is this?" They said to him, "Caesar's." Jesus said to them, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and to God the things that are God's." And they marveled at him. And we have some really smart people here. Chance Hicks is here. He's a very smart guy. Chance, do you think under that kind of pressure, you would be able to give that kind of answer? I know I couldn't. I mean, it's not just the ability to think quickly, but to think quickly under tremendous pressure when so many people are watching. But he had an answer, and it resulted in people marveling. Let's go to another example. Matthew 21:23. Matthew 21:23. When he entered the temple, the chief priests and the elders of the people came to him as he was teaching and said, "By what authority are you doing these things, and who gave you this authority?" And why are they concerned about that? Remember, this is the chief priest and the elders. They are the ones who are supposed to be in authority. So the elite, the noble class, the smartest men of their generation, and they're asking him, "Who gave you this authority?" And Jesus answered and said, "I also will ask you one question, and if you tell me the answer, then I also will tell you by what authority I do these things. The baptism of John, from where did it come? From heaven or from man?" They discussed it among themselves, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say to us, 'Why then did you not believe him?' But if we say from man, we're afraid of the crowd, for they all hold that John was a prophet." So they answered, we do not know." And he said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things." Have you ever let somebody lead you into an argument with a loaded question? It's hard not to do it. People can be very clever, especially when it comes to politics and religion. They've got this gotcha question. It's very difficult to work your way out of that. Now, they weren't asking this question because they really cared, so there was no point in answering that question. There's a lesson for us there. You don't have to answer every question, especially when it's a loaded question and somebody's just trying to get you and discredit Christ. It's not the time to talk about it. You can deflect, but only Jesus could deflect this artfully, right? I mean, he asked them this question, the baptism of John. He looked at the crowd around him, and he was able to put all this together so fast. From heaven or from men? If they say from heaven, then he'll say, "Why didn't you believe him?" If they say from men, well, they were afraid of the crowd, because the crowd, the people, believed John was a prophet. Let's go to the next chapter, Matthew 22. Look at Matthew 22, beginning in verse 23. The Sadducees come to him. We haven't encountered them tonight yet. You probably know the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection, heaven, hell, angels, demons, no spirit world. You had this one life, and when you died, that's all there was to you. And so they're going to question him about the resurrection. And they have this hypothetical situation. Verse 24, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies having no children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died, and having no children, left his wife to his brother. So to the second and third, down to the 7th. After them all, the woman died. In the resurrection, therefore, of the 7, whose wife will she be? For they all had her." So they got this black widow hypothetical, right? You get married to this woman, your days are numbered, right? So if she's had 7 brothers, and none of them had a child by her, and they think they've got him pinned, whose wife will she be? Now watch what he does, because he knows the real question is there a resurrection? But first he addresses the hypothetical. He answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God." They had 2 problems. They didn't study their Bibles, and they didn't have any faith. When you put that together, that's a dangerous combination for a religious leader. "You know neither the Scriptures nor the power of God. In the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." We infer from that the angels don't marry, and so in the resurrection, there is no marriage. A lot of questions are raised by that, but that handles the question they asked. He doesn't have to go on and on and on. He can end it right there. But remember, the real problem is with the resurrection, not whose wife this woman was in the afterlife. So he goes on to that. And he says, "As for the resurrection of the dead," verse 31, "have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac and the God of Jacob. He is not God of the dead, but of the living. And when the crowd heard it, they were astonished at his teaching. He's quoting from Exodus chapter 3, verse 14, where Moses is at the burning bush, and God is speaking to him, and he's making an argument based on the tense of the verb to be. He doesn't say, I was, in the days of Moses, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says, I am, present tense, the God of these three men who lived hundreds of years before Moses. And so he says, he's not the God of the dead, but of the living. Now, the question is, and the reason I go through all those is just to ask, would a person who didn't have control of his mental faculties be able to handle that kind of pressure and handle that kind of intellectual challenge on the spot without preparation or with preparation? And the answer obviously is no. If you know any individuals personally who deal with this, or you have any kind of knowledge of this kind of problem, you know really quickly they would not do well in these situations. And this was a day in the life of Jesus. Every single day he dealt with these things. And so he's not a liar. He's not a legend. Not a lunatic. What's left? Was he the Lord? That's the only option we've got left. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be talking about evidences of his divinity, that he is the Lord, of his resurrection. But I'm just going to give you a little bit tonight on how he fulfilled the prophecies. I said a while ago that there are over 300 messianic prophecies recorded in the Old Testament. And Jesus was able to fulfill all of them, every single one of them. A couple of examples. Let's go to Isaiah 53. I believe these are familiar to you. I pick Isaiah 53 because the prophecy is dated about the middle of the 8th century BC, before Christ. So 750 years before Jesus was born. Now, skeptics say it's not that old, but when we discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, we discovered some scrolls of Isaiah. They were older than the oldest manuscripts of Isaiah that we had at that time. They matched them almost perfectly. And what's really exciting is they were dated back to 100 BC. So you can't argue. I believe these prophecies are 750 years old. But say you don't buy that. You don't buy the Bible history. Archaeology has established that this is at least 100 years before Jesus' birth. And what does it say? Look at Isaiah 53, verse 3. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. He was wounded for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his stripes we are healed. You have there the substitutionary sacrifice of one that the people called a suffering servant in Isaiah 53. They, by the way, did not see this as a Messiah figure because of the suffering that he underwent. They didn't put that together with the kingly prophecies like in Psalm chapter 2. But Jesus fulfilled all of those. Going down to verse 7, he was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, like a sheep that before his shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. You think of Jesus' conduct when he was on trial before the Jews and before the Romans. One other one to point out. Verse 10. It was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offering. He shall prolong his days. The will of the Lord shall prosper. Verse 12. I will divide him a portion with the many, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his soul to death and was numbered with the transgressors. You think of the thieves on both sides of his cross. He was crucified as a common criminal. Now again, this is by archaeological standards, the oldest manuscript we found of Isaiah, 100 BC. And it matches perfectly what we see happen to Jesus. Go to Psalm 22. There's some interesting things there as well. These both are texts from the Old Testament we often read around the Lord's table. Do you recognize that first verse? My God, why have you forsaken me? Now, I know what a critic will say. He'll say, well, Jesus, he said those words like he was reading a script. You know, he saw these messianic prophecies, and he had it all planned out, what he was going to say, to make people connect him to the Messiah figure in the Old Testament. Okay, maybe he could have had the presence of mind to say that. But what about the rest of this? Verse 7, all who see me mock me. They make mouths at me. They wag their heads. Verse 14, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, melted within my breast. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to my jaws. Remember him saying, I thirst. They have pierced, verse 16, they have pierced my hands and feet. Verse 18, they divide my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Something I didn't mention with regard to Isaiah a moment ago is, in addition to the Hebrew writings, there was an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament that was completed in the time between the Testaments, somewhere between 200 and 300 BC. So now we're 300 years before the birth of Christ. Now Psalm 22 was written about 1,000 years before Jesus. But again, if you go with the skeptics' numbers, you go back to the Septuagint translation of the Old Testament, and it's 300 BC. Okay, so is that not enough time between prophecy and fulfillment to at least cause some amazement? I think it is. Now, here are some objections that people will make to this fulfillment of prophecy. As we investigate the question, was Jesus the Lord? The prophecies say yes. Well, someone will say, number one, the fulfillment of these prophecies could have been staged by Jesus and his apostles. We've already talked about this a little because we saw the accusation in the quotes that I shared at the beginning of class. Some of them could have been, like he could have decided to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? He could have spoken in parables, but he couldn't have contrived everything. He couldn't have contrived the spear. He couldn't have contrived not any of his bones being broken. He couldn't have contrived the casting lots for his clothing. He couldn't have contrived the 30 pieces of silver. And there are many, many other examples like that. It's just not possible for him to have staged this whole thing. And if he had, we return to the question, what was the point of staging a death from which he couldn't return if he wasn't the Son of God? He didn't fake his death. He actually died. That much is in the historical record, as we saw last week. And so this first objection doesn't hold water. Number two, the comparisons between the Messiah of Old Testament Scripture and Jesus were merely coincidental. Well, it was bound to happen, somebody might say. Eventually, somebody's going to match up with all 300 of those. I mean, people actually say that. I don't think I have to tell you that's a ridiculous charge. Now, there is a mathematician named Peter Stoner who did some research on the odds of somebody accidentally fulfilling just 8 of the 300 messianic prophecies. Now, he's only doing 8. And according to his calculations, the odds of a man fulfilling 8 of these prophecies by accident is 1 chance in 100 million billion. That's a 1 with 17 zeros, which is a mathematical impossibility. So that's just 8, not 300. Okay, last one. Maybe somebody says these prophecies were written at the time of Jesus. And we've already answered that. Isaiah was 750 years before Christ. Micah, who said he'd be born in Bethlehem, was 500 years before Christ. The Psalms were 1,000 years before Christ. Take those numbers out. Don't believe the biblical traditions. You still have to deal with the Septuagint that was written 300 years before Christ, the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been dated 100 years before Christ. None of these hold water. So what was he? Legend? No. He didn't follow the pagan myths. His disciples didn't create a legend after his death. Christianity wouldn't have been able to explode and thrive if that had been the case. Well, maybe he was a liar. How could that be? What was in it for him? And how could a man make such a positive mark on the world if he had been a deceiver? Maybe he was a lunatic. How would he have handled his critics the way that he did? He was the Lord. And we'll be looking at some more evidence toward that as the quarter goes on. Thanks for your attention. Any questions or anything you want to say before time's totally up? Jim.
You're talking about all 300. When someone tells a lie, they start telling a few, and they can't keep up with the few lies that they've told, and they get broken. Here we have 300.
It's too many people.
All of them were kept perfectly. If nothing else says he was the Lord.
A lie is too many people. A lie at this level would take too many people involved, and people talk. You know, I heard a guy trying to make the case that, and I don't want to talk about this after services if you disagree, but I heard a guy say that we didn't actually land on the moon. Now, the problem that he has is how many people had to be in on that and keep a secret for that many decades. You know, this just doesn't work. Well, the same is true here. I mean, that's some lie. A lie that changed the world? I don't think that makes any sense. Any other comments? Yeah, James.
Would you turn over to Psalm 91 and read verse 9?
Okay, Psalm 91, verse 9. Because you have made the Lord your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. Is that the right one?
No.
Yes, sir. Can you give me a hint what it might say?
It's one of those things where I have been looking at, it's 41, I'm sorry, Psalm 41.
Oh, okay.
41:9.
Psalm 41:9. Yeah. Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me. Which I believe the gospel writers quoted in telling this in John 13. It sounds like Judas, right?
How many hundred of years was that written before?
Yeah, 1,000 years before. And it's right on target, right? That's a good one. Anyone else?
We as Christians believe Jesus is Lord. The Jewish people in the Jewish faith, they don't believe that. They believe he was just a man or a prophet. Where would they fit into that?
Well, you use two phrases, the Jewish people and the Jewish faith, and those are not always the same thing. I mean, you think the first thousands of members of the church were Jewish people, so they're ethnic Jews and they're religious Jews. And I would say the religious Jews do not believe that Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. They probably would, most of them, call him a legend. I don't think they would go with liar or lunatic, although I'm sure there's some that would. But there are many ethnic Jews who call him Lord. And so I find sometimes people are confused by that. There are religious Jews and then there are ethnic Jews. They're not always one and the same. All right, thank you for your attention tonight. Appreciate it.